I never told my husband that I was the anonymous investor holding more than $6.4 billion in shares of his mother's company to his family. I was just a woman living simply with an ordinary job and no real influence. One day, my husband invited me to dinner with his parents. I wanted to see how they would treat a woman they believed was weak, insignificant, and easy to control. But the moment his mother slid an envelope across the table, I knew they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Hello, my name is Claire, and for years, I let my husband's family believe I was nothing, just a quiet woman with an ordinary job, a small apartment, and no power worth noticing. They talked over me at dinner, smiled while they dismissed me, and treated me like someone who could be bought, erased, controlled. I never told my husband that I was the anonymous investor holding more than $6.4 billion in his mother's company because I needed to see how far they'd go when they thought I was weak. Then came the dinner, the crystal, the silence, and the envelope sliding across the table. And in that moment, I knew my life was about to break open because they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Before we go any further, tell me what time are you listening to this? And where are you right now? Drop it in the comments. Because what happened next didn't just shake a family. It revealed how dangerous people become when they believe you don't matter. The envelope did not arrive dramatically. There was no raised voice, no slammed fist, no sudden pause in conversation. It simply slid across the polished walnut table, slow, deliberate, pushed forward by a manicured hand that had signed more hostile takeovers than birthday cards. The sound it made was soft, final. I watched it stop inches from my plate, right between the untouched salmon and the crystal wine glass I hadn't lifted all night. Across from me sat Eleanor Whitmore, her posture immaculate, her expression calm in the way only people with generational power can afford. She didn't look at the envelope once it left her hand. She looked at me. "Claire," she said gently, as if offering advice, not an ultimatum. "This is the most reasonable solution for everyone involved." To my left, my husband Julian Whitmore stiffened. His knee hit mine under the table, sharp and unintentional. I felt his breath catch before he spoke. "Mother," he said. "Already strained. What are you doing?" Eleanor finally glanced at him, her smile patient, practiced, the smile she used in boardrooms when men twice her age tried to interrupt. "Let your wife read," she replied. "She deserves clarity." Clarity. I picked up the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check, $750 issued by a private bank that prided itself on discretion. No memo line, no explanation, just a number, clean and precise. I didn't react. Eleanor noticed. Of course she did. Most people reacted to money instantly. Surprise, greed, fear, something. My stillness unsettled her. I saw it flicker behind her eyes before discipline erased it. "This isn't an insult," she continued. "It's acknowledgement. You entered this family without resources. We understand ambition. We respect survival instincts. But this marriage," Julian stood abruptly, chair legs screeching against hardwood. "This marriage is not a transaction." "Sit down," Eleanor said quietly. He didn't. "Julian," she repeated, firmer now. He stayed standing. I placed the envelope back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge, then folded my hands in my lap. "You're offering me money," I said evenly, "to leave my husband." Eleanor tilted her head. To correct a misalignment, her husband, Thomas Whitmore, cleared his throat from beside her. He hadn't spoken much all evening. He rarely did when Eleanor was present. "There's also documentation," he added softly. "An annulment. No scandal, no litigation." Julian laughed once short, incredulous. "You planned this. You invited us here for this." Eleanor's gaze never left me. "Dinner was a courtesy," she said. The conversation was inevitable. Around us, the dining room glowed with quiet wealth antique art, imported stone, a view of Manhattan's skyline framed like a possession. The kind of room built to intimidate without ever raising its voice. I had sat at this table dozens of times over the past 4 years. Tonight, I finally understood why. They weren't trying to humiliate me. They were trying to buy closure. "Claire," Eleanor said again, lowering her voice, "you're intelligent. You've adapted well. But let's not pretend love alone compensates for imbalance." Julian gave up options. Julian snapped, "I gave up nothing." She ignored him. "You live in a rented apartment." Eleanor continued, "You drive a 10-year-old car. You work a mid-level analytics job with no upward visibility. That is not the life my son was raised for." I met her eyes. "And this check," I said, tapping the envelope once, "fixes that. It gives you freedom." She replied, "And it gives Julian his future back." Silence stretched. I became acutely aware of every detail, the way Thomas avoided my gaze, the way Eleanor's fingers rested flat on the table, the way Julian's jaw trembled as he fought to stay composed. So, they believed this moment was controlled. They believed I was cornered. Eleanor leaned back slightly, signaling confidence. "You can take time," she said, "but understand this offer won't remain open indefinitely." I exhaled slowly. Then I reached into my coat pocket. Julian turned to me, panic breaking through his restraint. "Claire, I'm not signing anything," I said. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Just a fraction. I need to make a phone call." Her lips pressed together. "To whom, my attorney?" I replied. "Because if we're discussing contracts and money, then we should be accurate." Julian stared at me now, not confused, but startled, as if he were seeing a shape move beneath water and realizing it was far larger than he'd assumed. Eleanor watched me carefully as I unlocked my phone. Something had shifted. She felt it. "Claire," she said, her tone sharpening, "I don't appreciate theatrics." I looked up at her, calm. "This isn't theater," I said. "This is disclosure." I pressed the call button, and for the first time that evening, the woman who controlled half the skyline of Manhattan looked uncertain, because the dinner had never been about food, and the check was the smallest number in the room. Julian didn't speak while we walked out of the Whitmore townhouse. Not a single word on the marble steps. Not past the doorman who pretended he hadn't heard anything. Not into the cold bite of the city night. The wind off the Hudson cut between buildings like it had somewhere important to be. In the car, he kept both hands on the wheel, even though we weren't moving. His knuckles were pale. His jaw was locked so tight, I could hear the faint grind of teeth. "You knew," he said finally. His voice wasn't angry yet. It was worse than anger. It was wounded. Knew what I asked, already tasting the lie before it formed. He turned his head toward me, eyes wet but hard, that she would do something like this, that this dinner wasn't a dinner, that my mother wasn't inviting us here to reconnect. He swallowed. "And you still walked me into it." I stared out at the streetlight reflections on the hood of our car, letting the silence settle between us like dust. "I suspected," I said. "Not new." That's not an answer. I could have said what he wanted. "I'm sorry. I didn't think she'd go that far. I could have soothed him with the kind of apology people offer to keep peace. But peace was a luxury, and we had been living on borrowed peace for years. "She's been building toward it," I said quietly. This was just the version she thought would finally work. Julian's laugh was brittle. "Work," he gestured wildly. She tried to purchase our marriage like it was a broken property she could buy, renovate, and flip. My fingers tightened around my purse strap. "She believes money is honesty," I said. "She believes it's the only language that matters." "And what do you believe?" he demanded. I didn't answer fast enough. His gaze sharpened. "God," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "Is that why you stayed calm? Because you've been preparing for this?" I felt the question behind the question. Who are you? It wasn't new. It had always been there, buried beneath everyday life. The careful budgeting, the modest apartment, the deliberately normal routine. Julian loved me. I knew that. But he had never stopped wondering why I seemed so unafraid. I chose my words carefully. I stayed calm because panicking in front of Eleanor gives her power. I said, "And I'm tired of feeding her." Julian stared forward, breathing through his nose as if trying to slow his pulse. "She humiliated you," he said, softer now. And I just sat there. "You didn't," I corrected. "You stood up." And she ordered me to sit down. His voice broke, like I'm still 13. That hit something in me, not sympathy recognition. Because that was the Whitmore house. In one sentence, you could be a grown man with a career and a marriage. And Eleanor could still reduce you to a child with 2 syllables. I reached for his hand. He didn't pull away, but he didn't squeeze back either. "Claire," he said, staring at our intertwined fingers. "Tell me something. Just one thing that's real." My throat tightened. Everything was real. The love was real. The mornings were real. The quiet dinners in our small kitchen, real. The way he slept with one arm flung toward me like he was afraid I'd vanish, real. But there was a part of me he didn't know. A part I'd sealed behind reinforced doors, because once opened, it would change the entire architecture of our life. "You want the truth?" I asked. His eyes flicked to mine. "Yes." I exhaled slowly. "I didn't marry you for your name," I said, "and I didn't marry you for your money." Julian's lips pressed together. "I know that. No," I said gently. "You think you know it, but you've never had proof. Not against Eleanor, not against the world she built around you." He frowned. "What are you saying?" I stared at the Whitmore townhouse in the rearview mirror, warm, golden, untouchable. The place where I'd been treated like a temporary stain. "I'm saying," I said, "that I needed to know whether your family could accept me when they believed I had nothing to offer." Julian's face tightened. "And what did we learn tonight?" I didn't answer immediately. Because what we learned wasn't just about Eleanor. It was about how far she was willing to go. The Whitmores had always made their contempt elegant. At first, it was subtle. The first time I met Eleanor, she looked me up and down like a resume. She asked where I went to school. I told her public university in Ohio, scholarship, graduated top of my class. Her smile didn't move. "Oh," she said, "how resilient." Resilient, not brilliant, not impressive. Resilient like a stray animal that learned to survive winter. Thomas asked what I did for work. I said I analyzed data and built predictive models for a consulting firm. Eleanor nodded like I'd said I arranged flowers. "And your parents?" she asked. "My mother is a nurse," I said. "My father passed when I was 17. Her eyes softened for half a second. Then the softness became strategy. "That must have been very difficult," she murmured. "So you're—" Self-made. Self-made. Another word with teeth. Another way of saying you don't belong to a lineage. Julian had looked embarrassed that night. He squeezed my hand, apologizing without words. Later, when he dropped me off at my apartment, my real apartment. Back when we were still dating, he asked if I wanted to stop seeing his mother. I said no, not because I enjoyed her, I didn't, but because I knew something Julian didn't. Eleanor Whitmore was not a person you escaped by walking away. She followed, she calculated, she waited, and she always believed time belonged to her. After we married, she didn't even pretend to accept it. She simply began managing it at parties. She introduced me as Julian's wife and never used my name. At charity galas, she seated me next to donors' spouses who talked about Pilates and private schools. Women who smiled politely but looked at me like I was a strange accent they couldn't place. When the subject turned to investments, Eleanor would glance at Julian and say, "He handles that," as if I were incapable of understanding numbers. The worst was Lydia Carmichael. Eleanor adored her. Lydia had been Julian's college girlfriend, polished and pedigree perfect, a Princeton graduate, family money, a face that belonged on magazine covers. Lydia had not attended our wedding, but she appeared at Whitmore, events like a ghost that refused to move on. "Oh, Claire," Lydia once said at a fundraiser, champagne glass hovering near her lips, "you're so brave to marry into all this pressure." Brave again. As if love were war and I was a volunteer soldier. Julian tried to shut it down. He always did. But Eleanor had 1,000 ways to stab without leaving fingerprints. And I let her. I let her because I was watching. Because long before I met Julian, long before the Whitmore name meant anything personal to me, I had learned something from the world of money. People reveal their real character when they believe you have no leverage. And I needed to know what Eleanor would do when she believed she held all the cards. Tonight, she played the one she'd been saving. The check, the contract, the purchase, Julian whispered. "I hate her for this." His voice wasn't hatred toward his mother. It was hatred toward the part of himself that still wanted her approval. I reached up and brushed my thumb across his knuckles. "Then stop letting her define you," I said. He turned to me suddenly, eyes sharp. "And what about you?" he demanded. "Why do you look like you already knew you'd win?" I froze, just for a breath. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I'd win. Not emotionally. Not with Julian. And not with the monster Eleanor could become once she felt threatened. I stared at him, choosing a softer truth that was still true. "I look calm," I said, "because if I don't, I'll start shaking." Julian's expression changed. Something in him softened, then hardened again. "Claire," he said, "that phone call you made, your attorney, you've never mentioned an attorney in your life." I swallowed. "There are things I didn't tell you." I admitted. His face tightened. "What things outside?" The city moved on. Taxis honked. People laughed. A siren rose and fell like a distant warning. Inside the car, Julian waited, and I realized coldly, clearly, that Eleanor didn't just attack our marriage tonight. She forced my hand. Because secrets only protect you as long as no one drags them into the light. I looked at Julian and said, quietly, "If I tell you everything, it changes how you see me." He didn't blink. "Tell me anyway." I stared at him for a long moment. Then I nodded. "Okay," I whispered. "But not here, not in the car, not where we can be followed." Julian frowned. Followed? I didn't answer, because I didn't want to scare him yet. But I already knew something he didn't. Eleanor Whitmore didn't hand out checks unless she had backup plans. And the moment I refused her money, the game stopped being social. It became corporate. It became legal. It became dangerous. I started the car. Julian watched me, and for the first time in our marriage, he looked like he didn't recognize the woman in the driver's seat. Neither did I. Not anymore. If you want to continue, say next. Chapter 3: The Investment That Wasn't Supposed to Survive. I didn't drive straight home. Julian noticed within 2 blocks. "This isn't our route," he said, voice tight. "No," I replied. His fingers curled against the armrest. "Claire, where are we going?" I kept my eyes on the road, on the slick black ribbon of asphalt reflecting streetlights like spilled gold. "Somewhere Eleanor's people won't expect," I said. Julian gave a short, humorless exhale. "You really think she has people following us?" I didn't answer immediately, and that was answer enough. He looked out the passenger window, scanning for headlights that stayed too close, turns that mirrored ours. The Whitmores didn't need to tail you like a cheap thriller. They had subtler methods, private security firms, friends in precincts, assistants whose jobs were essentially surveillance dressed as hospitality. I took us into a parking garage downtown, one of those older ones with low ceilings and terrible lighting. I parked on a middle level, far from cameras, far from elevator traffic. Julian sat frozen when I turned the engine off. "What the hell is happening?" he whispered. I turned in my seat to face him. "Do you trust me?" I asked. He stared at me like the question itself was an accusation. "I married you," he said. "Of course I trust you." "That's not what I asked." My voice stayed soft. "Do you trust me enough to hear something that will make you furious and not walk away before I finish?" Julian's throat bobbed. "Just say it." I didn't reach for dramatics. No long speech, no cinematic pause. I pulled my phone up again and opened a folder Julian had never seen because it wasn't supposed to exist on any device that could be stolen, subpoenaed, or casually glanced at. Encrypted files, secure notes, names that didn't look like names. Julian's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" "It's my real life," I said. His jaw tightened. "Claire. My name isn't Claire." I cut in gently and watched his face change like a slow crack spreading through glass. "Not legally, not originally." Julian blinked once, twice. "What?" "My legal name is Marin Hale," I said. "Claire Novak is a name I used because it gave me a life that didn't come with history attached." Julian's breath hitched. "You changed your name." "Yes." Why I looked down at my hands. For a moment, I saw 17-year-old me at a hospital vending machine, counting quarters for coffee while my father's heart monitor flatlined behind a curtain. Because my father's death didn't just leave me broke, I said, it left me exposed. Julian stared, exposed to what I met his eyes, to people who smell opportunity in grief. I said, and to the kind of money that brings predators out of hiding. His mouth opened, then closed again. What money I took. One breath. Not Whitmore money. I said, older money. Smaller than what Eleanor pretends to control, but sharp, agile, the kind that moves quietly and buys influence in places you don't think about. Julian's voice dropped. "Marin!" "What are you saying?" I tapped my phone screen, opened a document with a simple heading, Hale Irrevocable Trust, Distribution Summary. Julian leaned in without meaning to. My thumb scrolled. Dates, transfers, holdings, numbers. He froze when he saw the first one, then the second, then the line item that changed the temperature of the air inside the car. "That's," Julian started, then swallowed hard. "That can't be real." "It's real," I said. His hands trembled slightly. This is millions. I corrected. Not anymore. Julian looked up sharply. Not anymore. I watched his face carefully as I said the part he would struggle to believe. I turned it into something else. He stared. What I exhaled through my nose, steadying myself. Julian, I said, 14 years ago, I bought a dying company. He blinked. What company? I didn't say Whitmore yet. Not because I was afraid, but because once I said it, there was no going back. The first shares were cheap. I continued, almost insulting. People were dumping them like garbage. Analysts called it a legacy corpse, too much debt, too many failed projects, too many lawsuits waiting to happen. Julian's expression sharpened. That sounds like yes, I said quietly. It was Whitmore. His pupils expanded. For a full second, he looked like his body forgot how to breathe. No, he said, flat. No, that's impossible. I held his gaze. I was 23. I said, I had a scholarship degree, a grief problem, and exactly one advantage I can read, risk the way other people read weather. Julian's voice cracked. You're telling me you bought stock in my family's company before you met me? Yes. He shook his head hard, as if trying to shake the words loose. Why, he demanded. Why them? Because Eleanor was over-leveraged. I replied, because she built her empire like a skyscraper on sand and called it genius. Because banks were quietly backing away, and she was too proud to admit she needed help. Julian's lips parted. You studied my mother. I studied the company. I corrected. Your mother just happened to be the most dangerous variable. He stared down at my phone again. What did you do? He whispered. I bought in through shells, I said. Layered entities. Delaware, Cayman, Luxembourg. The kind of structure Eleanor herself uses when she wants to hide ownership from the public. Julian looked sick. You did this alone. No, I admitted. I had counsel. I had a mentor, someone who owed my father a debt. I had people who understood how to keep my name out of rooms I didn't want it in. Julian's eyes snapped to mine. Is that why you have an attorney on speed dial? Yes. His voice rose. Is that why you never let me see your banking app? Why you always paid rent like it physically hurt you to let the money go? Because if I lived like what I am, I cut in, your mother would have hunted me from the first date. Julian's face contorted. She already hunts you. Not like this, I said. Not when she thinks you're prey and I'm just the trap. He swallowed, throat working. How much, he asked, barely audible. How much do you own? I hesitated just long enough for him to notice. Julian's eyes went wide. Marin, he said, how much? I looked at him and said the new truth, the revised number, the one that wasn't the original story, 39.6%. I said, as of last week, Julian's mouth dropped open. That's, he stammered, that's almost controlling. It's controlling with allies. I said, and I have them. Julian stared forward, shaking. My mother has been sitting across from you for 4 years, he whispered, thinking you're just a woman she can buy. I finished, yes. He turned to me sharply, anger surging up through shock. So you let her. His voice broke. You let her treat you like that. You let her treat me like that, like I was marrying down while you were holding the company under your thumb. I flinched, not because the words hurt, but because they were fair. I didn't do it to punish you. I said fast. I did it to protect what we had before it got contaminated. Julian's laugh was sharp, almost hysterical, contaminated. He gestured at the city, the air, the entire universe, Claire Moran, whatever my whole life is contaminated, it's my mother's favorite hobby. I reached toward him, but he pulled back, breathing hard. Why didn't you tell me before we married? He demanded. Because I was terrified. I thought, terrified that the first thing you'd see when you looked at me would be numbers. Terrified you'd smile the way Eleanor smiles, like money solves everything. Instead, I said the truest part. Because I needed to know you chose me without leverage. I whispered. I needed to know you loved the version of me who looked ordinary. Julian stared at me, eyes shining now. And if I didn't, he asked. If I'd been like her, then I would have walked away, I said simply. And you would have never known why. The words hung between us, heavy as stone. Julian looked down at my phone again, then back up. Eleanor, he whispered. She offered you $750,000, like she was tossing a bone. Yes, I said, and she did it because she thinks my price is small. Julian's voice lowered. She's going to find out she was wrong. I nodded once. Yes. He swallowed. What happens now? I stared at the dark windshield, at our faint reflections staring back like strangers. Now, I said, she counterattacks. Julian frowned. How do you know? Because Eleanor Whitmore didn't gamble unless she'd already stacked the deck. Because she wouldn't hand me a contract unless she'd prepared a narrative to bury me if I refused. Because people like her don't lose gracefully. And because I had seen her type before women who confuse control with love and power with morality. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. She didn't invite us for an annulment, I said. That was just step one. Julian's eyes narrowed. What's step two? I looked straight at him. She's going to make you doubt me, I said. She's going to make the board fear me. And she's going to make the public hate me, because if she can't buy me, she'll try to break me. Julian's breathing slowed. His shock hardened into focus. Then we don't let her, he said. I studied him. The man I married. The man who had spent years living under a mother's shadow and still found a way to be gentle. You're sure I asked? He nodded. Jaw set? Yes, he said. Tell me what to do. I swallowed, tasting the edge of what we were about to become. You don't do anything, I said. Not yet. Julian blinked. What you stay normal, I said. You act like you don't know. Because the most dangerous moment is right after you reveal you have power. I leaned closer, voice nearly a whisper. And Julian, what if your mother calls Lydia Carmichael? I said. Don't answer her. Julian's brow furrowed. Why, Lydia? I stared into the darkness beyond the glass. Because Lydia is the knife Eleanor keeps clean, I said, and she's about to use it. If you're ready for the next escalation, Lydia, the board, and the first leak, say next. Chapter 4, A Marriage Built on Silence. By the time we reached our apartment, the city had settled into its late-night rhythm, the kind where taxis moved slower and even the noise sounded tired. Julian didn't speak as we rode the elevator up, his reflection in the mirrored walls looking older than it had an hour ago. When the doors opened, he walked straight inside, dropped his keys on the counter, and finally turned to face me with an expression that wasn't anger anymore, but something heavier reckoning. So everything I thought was fragile, he said, voice low, controlled, was never fragile at all. It was protected. I set my coat down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little balance remained. It wasn't protected, I corrected. It was isolated. There's a difference. Julian laughed under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face. You say that like isolation is harmless. Claire Marin, you let me believe we were one bad month away from trouble. You let me worry about rent, about health insurance, about whether we could afford to start a family. Do you know what that did to me? He looked up sharply. Do you know what it's like to grow up with a mother who measures love in leverage, and then marry a woman who keeps secrets just as big? The words landed exactly where they were meant to. I didn't interrupt him. I had learned a long time ago that silence, used correctly, was more powerful than defense. I didn't lie to you. I said when he stopped pacing, I answered every question you asked. You just never asked the ones that would have cracked everything open. Julian stared at me, incredulous. That's your justification? No, I said evenly. It's my confession. He sank onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it might offer answers. My entire life, I've been trying not to become my mother, and tonight I realized something terrifying. He looked up. I married someone who understands her better than I ever did. That wasn't an insult. It was fear. I understand systems, I replied. Eleanor isn't special. She's just very good at pretending her control is benevolence. I needed to know whether you were free of that illusion before I tore it down. Julian shook his head slowly. You talk about my family like a hostile acquisition. Because that's how they operate, I said, and tonight they proved they'd treat our marriage the same way. He went quiet again, and I could almost see the internal war playing out love versus betrayal, admiration versus anger. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier. When did you know my mother would try to buy you out? I didn't know the timing, I admitted, but I knew the tactic. Women like Eleanor don't lose control quietly. They escalate in private first, then in public. The check was a test. If I took it, she'd control the narrative forever. And when you didn't, Julian asked, I met his eyes. Then she moves to step 2. He swallowed. Which is she'll call an emergency board dinner under the guise of concern. She'll frame me as a manipulator who married you for proximity. She'll leak just enough of the truth selectively to make me look dangerous. And she'll use Lydia to validate it. Julian's jaw tightened at the name. Lydia hasn't spoken to me in years. She doesn't need to speak to you, I said. She only needs to speak about me. Silence stretched between us, thicker now, but no longer empty. Julian stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city that had always belonged to his mother more than to him. If you're right, he said slowly, then everything changes tomorrow. Yes, I agreed, which is why you can't change at all. He turned. What do you mean, you go to work? You answer your mother's calls like nothing happened. You let her believe you're confused, hurt, maybe even angry at me. That's what she expects. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. What she doesn't expect is that I've already spoken to 2 independent directors who are tired of being managed by fear. Julian stared. You already moved pieces. I always do, I said softly, quietly, before anyone notices. He searched my face, and I saw it then the moment where fear gave way to something sharper. Understanding, not of the numbers, or the shares, or the power, but of me. You didn't marry into my family, he said slowly. You infiltrated it. I shook my head. No, I fell in love with you. Everything else was collateral. Julian let out a long breath, then nodded once. Okay, he said. Then tell me the rules. I didn't smile. This wasn't victory. It was alignment. Rule 1, I said. You don't defend me publicly. Not yet. Eleanor needs to believe you're uncertain. Rule 2, if Lydia reaches out, you listen, but you don't promise anything. And Rule 3, he asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the weight of what we were about to survive together. Rule 3, I said quietly, is that once this starts, there's no clean ending. We win by outlasting her, not humiliating her. Julian nodded, slow and deliberate. Then let's do it your way. I reached for his hand, and this time he squeezed back. Outside, the city hummed on, unaware that a war had just been agreed upon in a small apartment far from boardrooms and marble staircases. Eleanor Whitmore believed she had drawn first blood that night. What she didn't know was that silence had always been my weapon, and she had just given me permission to use it. Chapter 5. The Check and the Contract by Morning. Eleanor Whitmore had moved exactly as I predicted. Julian's phone rang at 7:12. Oh, am. Not a text. Not a voicemail. A call because Eleanor preferred pressure that demanded immediate obedience. Julian let it ring twice before answering, his expression carefully calibrated somewhere between tired and wounded. "Good morning, Mother," he said. I stood in the kitchen pretending to read emails, listening to only his half of the conversation, watching the tension settle into his shoulders like an old coat he'd never learned how to take off. Yes. No. Last night wasn't appropriate. I need time to think. Claire is still my wife. There it was. The pause. Eleanor had said something sharp, something surgical. Julian's jaw tightened. "I'm not choosing sides," he said. "I'm choosing my marriage." He ended the call without waiting for permission. "She's escalating," he said quietly, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I can hear it. She thinks I'm slipping out of her control." "She's afraid," I replied. "That makes her sloppy." Julian exhaled. "She invited the board to lunch. Emergency session. No agenda." I nodded once. "That's the contract phase?" He frowned. "Contract phase. Last night was the money," I said. "Today is legitimacy. She's going to make her offer look moral." By noon, the narrative was already forming. A financial blog published a blind item hinting that a senior executive's son had married into questionable motivations. By 2:00, Lydia Carmichael's name began circulating again soft mentions. Flattering quotes about protecting legacy and knowing when relationships become liabilities. Julian watched it unfold with a hollow expression. "She's rewriting me," he said, "turning me into a victim." "She needs you small," I said. "It justifies everything she's about to do." At 6 p.m., Eleanor summoned us again, this time not to her home, but to a private conference room overlooking the East River. Neutral territory, she would call it, controlled territory, in truth. The contract was waiting when we arrived. Not just an annulment now, a separation agreement drafted by one of the most expensive firms in Manhattan. Confidentiality clauses, non-disparagement. A carefully worded paragraph stating that I would voluntarily disengage from all Whitmore-affiliated enterprises. Attached was a revised offer, $2.4 million. Eleanor watched my face closely as I scanned the document, searching for a crack. "You see," she said calmly, folding her hands, "I am not unreasonable. I understand last night may have felt abrupt." Julian bristled. "You tried to buy my wife. I tried to protect you." Eleanor corrected smoothly. "From a mistake." I closed the folder and looked up at her. "You changed the number," I said. Her lips curved slightly. I adjusted for offense. "That's generous," I replied. "Still insufficient." The room went cold. Julian sucked in a breath. Eleanor's eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with calculation. "Careful," she said. "This is the moment where you decide whether you leave with dignity." "No," I said evenly. "This is the moment where you decide whether you stop pretending this is about Julian." She leaned back. Everything I do is about my son." I held her gaze. "Then why didn't you ask him what he wanted?" Julian straightened. "I want my wife," he said, "and I want you to stop treating her like a hostile asset." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something flickered there, annoyance, disappointment, something like grief. Then it vanished. "If you walk away from this offer," she said to me, "I won't be able to protect you from what comes next." I smiled faintly. "You were never protecting me." I slid the contract back across the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, mirroring her gesture from the night before. "You were protecting your narrative." Eleanor stood. "So be it," she said. "Then we proceed formally." She turned to Julian. "I hope one day you understand why I did this." Julian met her eyes. "I already do," he said. "I just don't forgive it." As we left the room, my phone vibrated once. A single message from Marcus. "My attorney. Board votes are shifting. 2 undecided, 1 hostile. Media pressure imminent." I typed back only 4 words. "Proceed to phase 3. Outside, the river reflected the city's lights in fractured gold. Julian reached for my hand, his grip tight, steady. "You still okay?" he asked. I nodded. Now it gets interesting. Because Eleanor Whitmore believed contracts ended wars. What she didn't understand was that contracts only mattered when both sides thought they could still lose. And I had already decided I wasn't here to be bought, buried, or erased. I was here to end the game she'd been playing for decades, quietly, legally, and without mercy. Chapter 6. The Call That Froze the Room. Eleanor moved faster than I expected, which told me one thing very clearly: fear had overtaken discipline. By the following afternoon, the narrative she'd been shaping behind closed doors went public. It didn't explode all at once that would have been crude. Instead, it seeped out through carefully chosen mouths. A business columnist hinted at opaque outside influence in Whitmore Holdings. A cable segment discussed the risk of personal relationships intersecting with corporate governance. By evening, my name wasn't spoken, but the outline of me was everywhere, drawn in suspicion and implication. Julian saw it first. He came home pale, phone still in his hand. "She's turning the company against you," he said, "against us." "She's trying to," I corrected. "That's different." At 8 that night, Eleanor called for a full executive briefing. Not a board meeting yet. A preliminary alignment session. She called it. I went with Julian, not as a spouse, but as a presence she could no longer pretend didn't exist. The room was glass and steel, high above the river, built to make people feel small against the view. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, composed, regal, every inch the woman who believed this city bent toward her will. "Before we proceed," she said, eyes locking on me, "there are concerns that must be addressed transparently." She gestured to a folder. Inside were selectively leaked documents, old shell entities, partial ownership trails, fragments stripped of context. Enough to alarm, not enough to explain. The executives shifted uncomfortably. Fear always did her work for her. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but I placed a hand lightly on his arm. "Not yet." Eleanor continued. "We need clarity on who is influencing this company and to what extent." That was my cue. "I agree," I said calmly. "Clarity is overdue." The room stilled. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "This is not the appropriate forum." "It's the perfect one," I replied, already pulling my phone from my pocket. "Everyone who matters is here." Julian turned sharply toward me. "Claire, I need 1 minute," I said softly. "That's all." Eleanor's voice cut in, sharp now. If you make this spectacle, I won't. I said, your numbers will. I placed the call. Marcus answered on the first ring. He always did when I used that line. We're live. I said, please proceed. I put him on speaker. The room leaned in without realizing it. Whitmore Holdings currently has 220 million voting shares outstanding, Marcus began, voice even, professional, unhurried. The largest single voting block is controlled by an entity registered as North Shore Meridian LLC, holding 38.2% as of market close yesterday. A ripple went through the room. Eleanor's face didn't move, but her hands tightened against the table. Marcus continued, North Shore Meridian is a wholly owned subsidiary of Hale Strategic Trust. Beneficiary and controlling authority, Marin Hale. Silence crashed down like a physical force. Julian sucked in a breath. Someone at the far end of the table swore under their breath. Eleanor stared at the phone as if it had betrayed her. For valuation context, Marcus added, the current market value of that position is approximately $6.4 billion, excluding derivative leverage. I didn't look at Eleanor right away. I looked at Julian. Shock had given way to something steadier in his eyes. Understanding, acceptance, resolve. Eleanor finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, deadly. You deceived us. No, I replied. I outperformed you. She straightened, fury bleeding through composure. This company is my life. And yet, I said evenly, you were willing to burn it down to control your son. Her gaze snapped to Julian. You knew Julian stood. His voice didn't shake. I know now. That was the moment she lost him. I saw it in her eyes, the calculation, the realization that leverage had slipped through her fingers. Marcus's voice returned. Given the current alignment of minority shareholders, Hale Strategic Trust holds effective voting control on executive leadership motions. I let that sit before adding, which means this ends tonight. Eleanor laughed once, sharp and humorless. You think this is over? No, I said. I think it's finally honest. I ended the call. The executives avoided Eleanor's gaze now. Fear had shifted direction. She had ruled them with certainty. Uncertainty was my weapon. You humiliated me, she said, her voice trembling despite herself. You tried to erase me. I replied, this is proportional. Julian stepped beside me, his presence firm. Mother, it's done. Eleanor looked at her son as if seeing a stranger. Perhaps she was, perhaps so was I. We left without another word. The elevator ride down was silent, heavy with aftermath. Julian reached for my hand halfway through, lacing his fingers with mine like an anchor. Outside, the city roared on, indifferent to fallen queens. Julian exhaled slowly. You just took her throne. I shook my head. No. I just reminded her she never owned it. And somewhere high above us, Eleanor Whitmore stood alone in a glass room, realizing that for the first time in her life, money had not obeyed her. Chapter 7. When Power Turns Violent. Eleanor Whitmore did not collapse after that meeting. She did not cry, scream, or retreat into silence. Women like Eleanor didn't unravel when exposed. They hardened. By morning, the counteroffensive was already underway, precise and ruthless, designed not to win outright but to poison everything I touched. The first strike came through the press. An article appeared in a respected financial outlet questioning the ethics of undisclosed influence by private trusts in publicly traded companies. No names were mentioned, but the timing was surgical. By noon, another piece followed, this one openly speculating about whether a non-operational spouse could be exerting inappropriate pressure on Whitmore Holdings through concealed structures. The implication was clear. I wasn't a strategist. I was a parasite. Julian watched the headlines stack up on his screen, his jaw tightening with every paragraph. "She's framing you as a threat to governance," he said. "As someone unstable, manipulative. That's intentional." I replied, "When women hold power quietly, they call us secretive. When we reveal it, they call us dangerous." By mid-afternoon, Eleanor escalated again. 3 board members requested an emergency compliance review, citing fiduciary concern. One of them was the hostile Marcus had warned me about a man Eleanor had mentored for years, loyal not to the company but to the mythology of her leadership. Another was undecided but afraid. Fear, when left unattended, always defected. The real blow came at 4:37 p. Julian's phone buzzed once, then again. Lydia Carmichael. He stared at the screen like it was radioactive. "She never calls directly," he said. "She does now." I replied, "Eleanor's out of intermediaries." He answered on speaker, "Julian." Lydia's voice was smooth, practiced, carrying just enough concern to sound sincere. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You are," he said flatly. "But go ahead." There was a pause, then the pivot. "I'm worried about you, about what's happening around you. People are talking, and not kindly." Julian glanced at me. I stayed still. "They're saying your wife orchestrated this," Lydia continued. "That she targeted your family. That you're compromised." Julian's voice sharpened. "Who's they? People who care about you," Lydia replied. "People who don't want to see you lose everything because you trusted the wrong person." That was Eleanor's language, word for word. "I haven't lost anything," Julian said. "I found the truth." Lydia sighed softly. "Truth is rarely clean, Julian. Sometimes it's engineered." I leaned forward then, just enough to be heard. "Tell Eleanor this won't work." Silence cracked through the line. "Claire," Lydia said slowly, "this doesn't concern you?" "That's where you're wrong," I replied calmly. "It concerns me more than anyone. And if Eleanor leaks anything false or incomplete, I will respond with filings, not interviews." Julian ended the call before Lydia could answer. The next hour confirmed what I already knew. Eleanor had crossed from strategic defense into personal warfare. Private investigators were contracted. Old employment records were requested. A former colleague of mine was contacted with carefully phrased questions about my temperament. This wasn't business anymore. It was character assassination disguised as due diligence. I sat at our kitchen table, laptop open, watching the data roll in from my legal team. Julian paced behind me, running a hand through his hair again and again. "She's trying to make you radioactive," he said, "so no one will stand with you." "She's trying to isolate me," I corrected, "because isolation makes people easier to erase." My phone buzzed. Marcus again. "She's pushing for a special board vote," he said without preamble. "Not removal, restriction. She wants to suspend your voting rights pending investigation." Julian swore. "Can she do that?" "Only if people panic," I said, "and that's what she's counting on." I closed the laptop and stood. "It's time." Julian stopped pacing. "Time for what?" "To stop playing defense," I replied. Eleanor understands only one language now: consequence. That night, I authorized 3 actions. First, my attorneys filed a formal disclosure with regulators, preempting Eleanor's narrative and establishing transparency on my holdings and governance boundaries. Second, I released a controlled statement, brief, factual, unemotional, affirming that my investment predated my marriage by more than a decade and that I had never interfered in day-to-day operations. No spin, no apology, just record. third and most important, I called the independent directors myself, not to threaten, not to persuade, to remind them that fear was not leadership, and silence would not protect them. By midnight, 2 had committed. By morning, the third would fold. Julian watched me work with something like awe and something like grief. "You're not fighting her," he said quietly. "You're dismantling her." "No," I corrected. "I'm letting her collapse under the weight of what she built." Outside, the city slept, unaware that one of its most powerful women was burning through the last of her credibility in a desperate attempt to remain untouchable. Eleanor Whitmore had always believed that authority meant never having to explain yourself. What she was about to learn was far more dangerous when the story changes. Authority answers to everyone. Blood is not authority. Eleanor didn't call Julian the next morning. She appeared at his office, not through an assistant, not with notice, not politely. She walked past reception like the building still belonged to her, heels sharp against the floor, posture rigid with the kind of fury that had learned how to dress itself as dignity. Julian was in the middle of a meeting when the door opened. His colleagues froze. Eleanor didn't acknowledge them. She looked only at her son. "We need to talk," she said. Julian stood slowly. "You don't get to ambush my workplace. I built half the partnerships that keep this firm alive." Eleanor replied coldly. "I'll go where I please." Julian glanced at his team. "Give us the room." When the door closed, Eleanor finally let the mask slip. "She's destroying everything," she said, voice shaking just enough to sound like pain instead of rage. "The board, the press, the company, she's turning them against me." Julian's expression hardened. "You did that yourself. She's manipulating you," Eleanor snapped. "She planned this." "From the beginning," Julian laughed. "Once bitter. You offered her money to erase my marriage. That was protection. That was control." Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't understand how dangerous she is. People don't quietly accumulate that kind of leverage without intent. She married you to get closer to power." Julian met her eyes. "Then explain this to me," he said. "Why did she live small? Why didn't she use me, or my name, or your influence? Why did she let you humiliate her for years if this was a con?" Eleanor hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, it was enough. "She was waiting," Eleanor said finally. "Waiting to strike." Julian shook his head slowly. "No, she was waiting to see who you really were." Eleanor's face tightened. "I am your mother." "And she is my wife," Julian replied, "and the only person in this entire situation who didn't try to buy, threaten, or rewrite me." Eleanor's voice rose. "I gave you everything. You gave me expectations," Julian shot back. "And punishment when I didn't meet them." Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Eleanor's eyes glistened, but her pride didn't bend. "If you stand with her," she said quietly, "you lose your family." Julian answered without hesitation. "If I abandon her, I lose myself." That was the moment, the one Eleanor never anticipated. Not resistance, not rebellion. D'adversaire. Aha! Eleanor straightened, wounded pride hardening into resolve. "Then you've chosen." "Yes," Julian said. "I have." She left without another word. By evening, the board convened. Not an emergency session, a formal vote. Eleanor arrived late, composed, convinced that legacy would carry her through. She spoke first, framing the situation as instability, as betrayal, as an external threat introduced through marriage. She didn't mention money. She didn't mention contracts. She spoke of values. Then I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I laid out facts, timelines, filings, proof that my involvement predated every personal connection, proof that every capital infusion Eleanor claimed as vision was backed by risk she never took alone. I ended with one sentence. This company doesn't need a ruler. It needs governance. The vote followed. It wasn't unanimous. It didn't need to be. Eleanor Whitmore was removed as CEO by a clear majority. Offered an advisory role, symbolic, toothless. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply looked at Julian across the room, as if seeing him for the first time. "You let her do this," she said. Julian answered quietly. "You forced her to." Eleanor walked out. Later that night, Julian and I sat in our apartment, the city humming below us like nothing monumental had happened. He stared at his hands for a long time before speaking. "I lost my mother today." I took his hand. "No," I said gently. "You lost the version of her that needed to own you." He nodded, eyes wet but steady. "And you?" "I never wanted her power," I replied. "I just refused to be erased by it." Outside, the war Eleanor started was over. Not with destruction, but with a choice she never believed anyone would make. What remains after power? Leaves the city didn't notice when Eleanor Whitmore fell. There were no sirens, no breaking alerts, no crowds gathering outside glass towers. Power rarely ends with spectacle. It dissolves quietly, leaving behind the echo of certainty that once filled rooms. By Monday morning, Whitmore Holdings issued a neutral press release announcing a leadership transition aligned with long-term governance objectives. Eleanor's name appeared once, buried in the third paragraph, followed by the word advisor. It was the corporate equivalent of exile. Julian read it at the kitchen counter, coffee going cold in his hand. "That's it," he said. "After everything, that's always it." I replied, "Empires don't mourn. They reorganize." The aftermath arrived in fragments. Board members who once deferred to Eleanor now requested meetings with me, careful, respectful, eager to understand the rules of a system they'd never been allowed to question. Analysts revised their tone overnight, reframing the narrative from scandal to foresight. Lydia Carmichael disappeared from the conversation entirely, retreating back into the safety of irrelevance once her usefulness expired. Eleanor's allies recalibrated. Fear changed direction. Julian's phone stayed quiet. That was the hardest part. He didn't pretend it didn't hurt. Grief doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it settles in like fatigue. One evening, as we sat on the couch with the windows open and the sound of traffic drifting up from the street, he spoke without looking at me. "I thought choosing you would feel like victory," he said. "It feels like loss." I didn't correct him. "Both can be true," I said. He nodded slowly. "She called me her legacy. For years. That word felt heavy. Tonight it feels empty." "You were never a legacy," I said. "You were a person she tried to turn into proof." That night, a letter arrived. Not from Eleanor, from Thomas. Short, unadorned. He apologized without explanation, acknowledged harm without defending intent, and ended with a sentence that mattered more than the rest. "I hope one day she learns how to love without leverage." Julian read it twice, then placed it in a drawer and closed it gently, like something fragile he wasn't ready to handle. The company stabilized quickly. With professional management in place, Whitmore Holdings regained the trust Eleanor had spent years cashing in. I declined the ceremonial roles, the photo ops, the invitations to become the visible face of change. Influence worked best when it didn't need applause. I funded governance reforms, strengthened compliance, and stepped back. Power, once proven, didn't need to be rehearsed. We stayed in our apartment, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. The city outside felt different now, less like a battleground, more like a place that belonged to us again. Julian asked, half smiling. Do you ever regret not telling me sooner I considered it? No, I said. If I had, you would have been forced to choose under pressure. This way, you chose freely. He nodded, then laughed softly. You let my mother show me who she was. I let her speak, I replied. She did the rest. Months later, Eleanor resurfaced once. Not publicly, not strategically. She requested a meeting neutral ground. No attorneys. Julian went alone. When he returned, his eyes were red, but his shoulders were lighter. She said she doesn't understand the world anymore. He told me. She said money used to answer everything. What did you say? I asked. That it still does, he replied. Just not the way she thinks. We didn't rebuild a relationship. We redefined distance. Some doors close gently, others lock themselves. On our balcony, the city lights stretched out like a map of choices already made. Julian leaned against the railing, quiet, thoughtful. You know what scares me now? He said. I waited. That I almost let her convince me you were dangerous, he said, when the only thing you ever did was refuse to be owned. I took his hand. Being underestimated isn't a weakness, I said. It's an advantage you only lose once. He smiled, then real, unburdened. What happens next? We live, I said, without performing, without proving. Below us, traffic flowed somewhere else. Eleanor Whitmore learned how silence sounds when it isn't obedience. And here, in a modest apartment we chose on purpose, we learned something simpler and far rarer, that power fades, blood complicates, but integrity, quiet, patient, unbought outlasts them all. The war didn't end with destruction. It ended with clarity. And that was enough.